Hey guys, Argent Templar here. So last time we covered the Old Testament, so let's look at the New Testament. Mainly talking about the Gospels, as the letters are pretty self-explanatory and they're all very short. So the vast majority of the New Testament is the Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. The rest of this stuff is literally just letters. So the four Gospels all cover the life of Jesus. They're all basically a biography of the life of Jesus, but they're extremely different from one another. And I don't mean they contradict one another. They emphasize certain details, but they're all written for different audiences, and they're all written to convey a certain thing. If you are familiar at all with the Myers-Briggs personality test, each gospel is basically written from a particular temperament, from one of the four temperaments. Luke is NF, John is NT, Matthew is SJ, and Mark is SP. And they're all written for, like I said, different people. They emphasize different things and they take very different approaches. So Matthew is the first and I believe the oldest gospel. Matthew emphasizes the Jewishness of Jesus. There's an extensive genealogy in it. The majority of the book focuses on Jesus' sermons, on his quotations from the Old Testament, how he is a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, how how he teaches from the Old Testament, how he's from the house and the line of David, how he is the prophesied Messiah. It was primarily written because it was the earliest for Jewish audiences. It was written for Jewish audiences to, Jewish Christians to convince them and confirm to them that Jesus was a fulfillment of their religion. That they could be Christian while still retaining their Jewish identity. This changed in time, but in the very early church, the majority of the people, at least for the first couple years, were Jewish. So Matthew is the SJ gospel. It emphasizes Jesus' adherence to Jewish law, his focus on him as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, so he extensively quotes the Old Testament, focuses on Jesus' words and words. Mark is the SP gospel, and it focuses on Jesus' deeds, on his miracles, etc. By the way, just a side note, in Revelations, there are four living beings mentioned, four angels. One has the face of a lion, which is Matthew, emphasizing majesty and kingship. One has the face of an ox, or a cow, emphasizing action and actively giving life, and deeds, which is Mark. One has the face of a man, which is Luke, and one has the face of an eagle. And these are represented in Revelation as the four Gospels and the four temperaments. Sorry, side note. So Mark is the words and actions, so it focuses on Jesus' miracles, his strength, and his power, but in a physical sense. John also focuses on Jesus' strength and power, but in a completely different sense. So these are the two most kind of grounded Gospels. Luke is the NF Gospel. Luke is the only writer in the Bible who is not Jewish. He was a Syrian Greek who converted to Christianity, and he was a trained physician, and he was a doctor. He was a doctor. He was well educated, well read, and he wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. So, Luke mainly focuses on Jesus's personal interactions, his kindness and compassion, his empathy to the downtrodden of society, particularly his empathy towards the poor and to Gentiles, that is, non-Jews. Luke is the most emotional of the four Gospels and kind of the most human. It was made to emphasize Jesus' humanity. Luke was very much written for a Gentile audience, as was Mark. Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. Then we come to John. Now these are called the Synoptic Gospels because they're all very similar, and it's believed they're all based on a single source called Q, I think is what it's called. They believe that these are all derived or all based on. Luke is from as far as we can tell, kind of a professional historian. So he says that he interviewed people at the start of his gospel. Um, but he largely is thought, because these three are so similar, that they used a common source. John is completely different. John is by far my favorite gospel, and I'm an INTJ, so of course the NT gospel would be my favorite. John emphasizes the divinity of Christ. It emphasizes how far beyond a human is. It begins with calling Jesus God. Many people know the beginning of John. In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was sent to us, etc., in the form of Jesus. I'm extrapolating, but yeah. So John is very philosophical. It's very kind of esoteric. It just emphasizes Jesus is very kind of surreal in it, very much a larger than life figure. I think John, which is represented by the gospel, is very much the focusing on him being the man God, because he is man, but he is also God. So my favorite gospel, I would recommend reading it, even if you don't read the others. So then we have Acts. Acts is also written by Luke, and it talks about what happens post crucifixion, and it's a basic historical book about the what happens to the apostles in the aftermath of Jesus' crucifixion, how the early church starts, and how it spreads across the ancient Mediterranean world. So it's a very good historical book. It's very useful. I think actually the guy who discovered Troy converted to Christianity because Luke's references a description of Asia Minor was so much like what he uncovered. So we have Acts of the Apostles. Most of it focuses on the Apostle Paul, who is a Jewish Roman citizen who was Greek educated, who converted to Christianity, and he was the main apostle to the Gentiles because he was trained in Greek philosophy and Roman law. So he was able to go and debate with the Greeks, and he was eventually executed in Rome. So then we have Paul's letters. Paul wrote the most letters of any apostle because he spoke excellent Greek and Latin, and he was also trained, like I said, in Greek philosophy and Roman law. So these letters are written to basically whatever the name of the letter is, that's who it's written to. So this is written to the church in Rome, the church in Corinth, the church in Galatia, the church in Ephesia, the church in Thessalonica. These are all names of churches. Um, and these are just answers to questions or advice. So these are kind of part sermon, part kind of administrative, etc. They're very compressed, very dense, and very short. So I'd recommend probably just reading all of these. This is really where you can see the beginnings of formal Christian doctrine. Because none of this is really doctrine, this is just a story. A story which we extrapolate doctrine from, but largely just the story of Jesus' life. This is Paul, one of the apostles, giving his opinions on things, talking about how to live, etc. So very important. Then we have a couple letters Paul wrote to friends of his. Once again, very similar to this, but just giving some advice, answering some questions, etc. Then we have a number of letters which are written by other apostles to various churches, and some are general letters, some are to certain people. Did the apostles mentioned here actually write them? It's an interesting question. It's generally believed either they wrote them or someone wrote them on their behest, or like a friend of them wrote them. Maybe a student of them, etc., but we're fairly sure they're connected to them in some way. So they're written by John, Peter, James, etc., and I'm not sure if we know who wrote Hebrews. I'm sure we do. Then we have Revelation, which is probably my favorite book in the Bible, which is the one where all the crazy stuff happens, much like Ezekiel. It's where it's entirely prophecy. Basically, John is sitting on the island of Patmos, waiting to die. He's in exile, and he has this crazy vision of the future, of the end of the world, and he sees the end of the world. He sees the end to all things. He sees stuff like the Whore of Babylon, the seven-headed dragon. He sees the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the Antichrist, the one world government, the one world religion. All that stuff is from Revelation. It's entirely symbolic, entirely metaphorical, and it's just one wild thing after another. And it really is a good capstone to the Bible. Because we have it begin with Genesis, which is the creation of all things, and Revelation, which is the end of all things. Maybe I'll do a video on the interpretations of Revelation, because it's a very interesting topic. But it's very much kind of a summation of all the core themes of the Bible, and is a very good place to end it off. Because beginning, end. And Revelation is written by John, or at his behest. And they're extremely similar in their style. Very intellectual, very abstract, very esoteric. So, you say all this is nice, so how do I read the damn Bible? Okay, so let's just go over this again. So I'd say Genesis, Exodus, the history books, Job, Ecclesiastes, the major prophets minus Jeremiah and Lamentations, a couple of the minor prophets, and all of the New Testament. If you don't want to really read the whole New Testament, I recommend just reading the Gospels or picking a Gospel or two, maybe John and Luke, which are my two favorites. So maybe picking John and Luke, then Acts, then just going to Revelation. All the letters are useful and valuable, particularly if you're trying to understand salvation and Christian doctrine. But if you just want to get the core story and nothing else, it's these books, these three books, and the Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. And that is the complete history and the complete story of the Bible. All the other stuff has extra stuff. Ecclesiastes is an excellent existentialist work. Job is an excellent kind of existentialist work. But a lot of the rest of the stuff is just doctrine or lectures or other stuff that's just included. But that is really the core of the Bible, and that is really the stuff you need to read to understand all of it. I'm trying to cut it down a bit because the Bible is very long. A lot of it is kind of dry, and a lot of it you're just wondering, why is this here? I want to get back to the story. I want a logical progression and a framework to understand this stuff with. So that's my two-parter on the Bible. Maybe I'll do some more about it, but hopefully that helps you out. This is Argent Templar signing out.